Fuegan. Sexy Fuegan. Phoenix Lord of the Fire Dragons, the Dragons of Fire. In this video, I'll be looking at the original model for him, painting him up, and discussing his rules in 2nd edition 40k. Before I start, if you would like regular updates on my hobby adventures, then please do have a look at my Instagram. Historically, Eldar have not been a range of miniatures which have appealed to me. They've always seemed a lot more complicated to paint than, say, Space Marines or Orcs. But I think I've got better at painting over the last couple of years, and I think it's ready to try something a bit more challenging. Not that I don't have enough miniatures to paint already, but a friend of mine asked me to paint a few of his, namely the Eldar Phoenix Lords. He gets some painted models, and I get some more fodder for the channel. A reasonable deal, I thought. So I started Fuegan back in July, but like any fickle individual who's also a hobby butterfly, I got distracted by a range of Chaos miniatures, which I'm yet to make a video about. I guess a recent announcement from Games Workshop led me to finish this miniature. The first Fuegan miniature was a metal model released in May 1994, alongside Codex Eldar for 2nd edition 40k. Several other miniatures were also released that month, and featured in White Dwarf issue 172, namely the Eldar Avatar, Garandrus, and Azerman. Fuegan is featured alongside the other Phoenix Lords in the heavy metal pages of this publication. It's quite an Eldar heavy issue actually, filled with background information and many beautiful paint jobs. It seems to me that the Fuegan miniature was an instant hit, especially with high-end painters, since at least 2 copies of this miniature were entered into Golden Demon of that year, as featured in White Dwarf 174 a couple of months later. As beautiful as these paint jobs are, and I include the official heavy metal paint job when I say this, the work that inspires the way I am painting Fuegan is this one featured in Codex Eldar from the 3rd edition of Warhammer 40k. It occurs on the back of the Codex, and in the centre pages painted by Chris Smart. This sculpt, though old, certainly has a lot going for it. I like the way the dragon elements come through strongly in this sculpt, designed by Jez Goodwin, including the skulls on the chest and waist, as well as the scales on his tabard and his helmet. I've actually never painted an Eldar miniature before, and I feel like I'm diving in the deep end with this one. It feels a little intimidating, but by Jove, I'm going to give it a good go. The model came in 2 pieces, the main piece consisting of the torso and fire pike, and the other piece, which was the fire axe, although by the time this model reached my hand, the fire axe was already attached to the rest of the model. The original base was 25mm, which was the style at the time. The tab on the base indicates that the miniature was sculpted in 1993. I dare say this is quite a flat miniature, but that's just a symptom of the era in which it was created. There's mould lines running around the periphery of this miniature. These will have to go, as well as the obligatory wormy which, in my experience, seem to accumulate around the toe area in models from this time. Unfortunately, I was a bit rough during the cleaning process, and the fire axe came away from the rest of the model, but it was nothing that some simple pinning couldn't solve. After some bending of the tab, and some superglue, the model was ready to be pushed into the base. I used Mod Podge to affix some sand to the base, followed by a black prime. The first coat I wanted was dark red, and I began with Burnt Cadmium Red by Vallejo. This was applied all over the armour, including the helmet. Comparing this with my reference photo, it didn't seem quite dark enough around the helmet though. So, I mixed this red with a spot of black and repainted it. A few glazes of this gave me the colour I was looking for. To get a gradient of red to almost black, I decided to glaze on various reds beginning with Citadel Mephiston Red. My paint was heavily thinned with water, and several coats were applied to the edges. With each successive coat, I covered slightly more area than before. When I was happy with that, I switched to Vallejo Dark Vermillion. again glazing from the edges and covering slightly more area with each glaze. At one stage, I felt like I needed the recesses to be darker, so I used a little Nuln Oil here and there, namely where the helmet met the crest and between the plates on his shoulders. I continued to build up the layers of red on the helmet and torso, taking care not to let any of the thinned paint flow into the recesses. Some Vallejo Orange Red was applied to the tips of the crest, and followed up with a mix of orange, red and white to edge highlight the spikes. With the helmet pretty much done, I repeated this process on the rest of the armour as well. The Phoenix Lords are itinerant Eldar with no craft world to call their home. They are driven by war and attracted by intuitive power to places of great danger and need. Their mode of travel is the Eldar Webway, following the path of the bloody-handed god. Some Phoenix Lords are as old as the Fall, heroes during the Cataclysm, well known amongst the Eldar race. They were the first to bear the Spirit Stones of the warrior aspects. They are the most fearsome of all Exarchs, and the most powerful warriors of all the Eldar. When a Phoenix Lord dies, their place is taken by another Eldar who assumes their costume and identity. In this way, the Phoenix Lords are reborn into a fresh cycle of existence. Their armoured suit contains a Spirit Stone, which houses the spirits of all the Eldar who have become that Phoenix Lord. Yet, no matter how many different individuals a Phoenix Lord may have been, their mind is forever the same, driven by the dominant personality of the first and greatest to wear the suit. Fuegan, the Burning Lance, is one such Phoenix Lord, and founder of the Fire Dragon Shrine. He teaches them in the art of war with fire and flame. Tradition has it that Fuegan will be the last of the Phoenix Lords to die when they all gather for the final battle, the Rana Dandra. In 2nd edition Warhammer 40k, Fuegan has an impressive profile, fast with a movement of 6 and initiative 8, and adept with ranged and close quarter weapons alike. Being a Phoenix Lord, he is immune to psychology, never needing to take a break test, and always being assumed to pass any leadership test he is required to take. He possesses the following 3 Exarch warrior powers: Turn-Aside Blow, Mighty Strike, and Fast Shot. He is armed with a massive deadly fire pike, and carries the fire axe. Turn-Aside Blow is a 5-point Exarch power, which allows the Exarch to parry a blow in hand-to-hand combat, even if he does not have a sword or other suitable parrying weapon. When an Exarch parries using this power, he may force his enemy to re-roll up to 2 attack dice rather than the usual 1. Mighty Strike also costs 5 points. If the Exarch inflicts 2 or more hits, then he may choose to exchange all hits for a single hit with a strength bonus. The strength bonus is +1 for each extra hit scored, so you could exchange 2 strength 4 hits for a single strength 5 hit, or 3 strength 4 hits for a single strength 6 hit, and so on. Although with his fire axe, Fuegan is always going to be hitting with a minimum of strength 6. Fast Shot is a 25-point Exarch power, which allows him to shoot twice in the shooting phase. He can shoot at the same target, or separate targets. It's up to you. As an aside, regular Exarchs can take up to 2 Exarch warrior powers, which will either cost 5, 10, 15 or 25 points. As mentioned already, Fuegan is equipped with 2 weapons, the Fire Pike, which is a long-range melter gun, and the Fire Axe, which is a souped-up power axe. Fuegan wears Exarch armour, which confers a 3+ save. Including war gear, his total cost comes to 176 points. I needed to take a break from the reds, so I decided to focus on the dragon scales on his tabard. The base coat was Caliban green, which I also applied to the scales on his helmet, as well as the various gems you can see around his body, and boy, does he come with some gems. When the first coat was dry, I switched to Citadel Warpstone Glow, painting slightly less area than before. This colour was also applied to the bottom third of all the gems. Fuegan also has this little tassel hanging down from his axe, and a piece of cloth around his waist. These got the same green treatment as the dragon scales. I made sure to use the flat edge of my brush to pick out the details on the tassel. But that wasn't the final layer of green. I decided to use an old paint that I still have called Scorpion Green to highlight the bottoms of the scales, and to paint a thin line across the bottom of each gem. I also highlighted the cloth in the tassel in the same way. I think Moot Green is the equivalent colour that Citadel produces these days. In line with the dragon theme, Fuegan has a skull on his chest and just above his tabard. The base coat for these was Vallejo Tan Earth. When that was dry, I thinned down some Agrax Earthshade and let it settle into the recesses. The wash didn't accentuate the different bone sections though, so I used a little black lining to remedy that. My lines were still too broad, but I would fix that in the next step. With my second smallest paintbrush, I painted Vallejo Dark Sand onto all the raised areas, and finally highlighted those with white. While the paint in each of these steps was drying, I focused on another area of the model, which is why some of this footage seems to be a bit out of order. Fuegan's weapons and the trims on his armour were going to be painted gold, so like I did for my Chaos Space Marines, I base coated all the areas that were to be gold with flat brown by Vallejo. The most notable areas were the fire axe and the fire pike. If you've never heard me say this before, the reason I base in brown is because I find the gold paint I use goes better onto brown than it does onto black, needing only one coat. It also means I can leave the brown showing in some places, which acts as a shade. At this stage, I noticed that the armour wasn't quite as red as I wanted it, so I went back in with some Vallejo Dark Vermillion. Here's how Fuegan is looking so far, and dare I say that it's quite a view from this angle. On goes the gold, and if you watch my videos before, then there should be no surprise that my gold of choice is Dwarven Gold by Metal and Alchemy. It's so bright and vibrant. Again, it was time to do some tidying up on the armour. I used Vallejo Orange Red to edge highlight the sharpest parts on the armour. However, this wasn't the final highlight. For that, I used some of the orange red again, but this time mixed with white. Using a 0.0 size brush, I picked out the sharpest edges on the armour to make it really pop. Speaking of popping, I went back to the green dragon scales and painted their tips with a mixture of scorpion green and white. While the white was on my wet palette, I painted the tiniest dot of white into the corner of each emerald. Sorry, not the corner, the side, no, some part of the emerald, anyway, some part of the emerald. Back to the gold. My technique of choice for shading is to use Citadel Reikland Fleshshade. I don't liberally wash all the gold areas, but stick to the cracks and recesses, although sometimes I glaze an area to add a bit of dramatic shadow, or whatever, I don't know if that's even a real term. The time had come to try the Wolf Grey by Warpaints Fanatic, which I bought recently. I'm a fan of desaturated blue-grey, particularly Thunderhawk Blue by Citadel, but I like to try other manufacturers too. Anyway, I applied this to the back and the edges of the tabard. Then, using the side of my brush, I carefully run it along the pipes, so the raised portions only pick up the blue paint. This is a real time saver if done carefully, since you don't have to paint each rib separately. Sure, I could have painted it all blue and washed it afterwards, but I prefer this look since it has more definition. While this blue was on my palette, I mixed in a little white and used the same technique to highlight the tabard and pipes. Citadel Flashkit's yellow was the colour I chose for the eye lenses, though I base coated this area white before applying the yellow. And then it was time to highlight the gold. I mixed my gold paint with this bright silver in about a 50-50 mixture, and then I painted it on all the raised areas, including these little lozenge things, and went around the edge of the gun as well. When that was dry, I used some of the silver neat to do some further edge highlighting, including the edge of these recesses on the end of the gun barrel. Notice as well, I've painted the middle of the fire pike a lighter shade of gold. This seemed to be the case on my reference picture, and I thought it looked cool. One detail on the fire axe was a flame on the blade. I first painted it corn red, then later covered it with dark vermilion, and finally orange red, a bit like the technique I used on the armour. At this stage, Fuegan was pretty much done. You may notice that I painted this line of gold around the emerald on his helmet just above the eyes. The textured part of the base was painted with Tan Earth, followed by a dry brush of dark sand, and the rim was painted with Army Painter Goblin Green, which normally takes 3 or 4 thinned coats for best results. Now, on my reference picture, the helmet has this rune symbol. I looked for it on my transfer sheets, but it wasn't present, so I decided to freehand it instead. I didn't film this process while painting it on the model, but just to show that I can freehand, here's me doing it on this tiny piece of paper. And here it is, done and dusted. The first Eldar model I have painted. I think it turned out pretty well, and it's definitely been good practice keeping my hand steady, with all these fine lines and fine details. This model is an absolute beaut as well. Although it seemed daunting at the start, I've really enjoyed painting the dragon scales and the subtle edge highlighting. His fire pike is just phenomenal, though there's something about his armour, which somebody told me was remarkably sexy, a bit like he's wearing nothing at all. Anyway, this year has been about mainly painting Chaos miniatures. I think next year, the Eldar are going to get their time in the spotlight. I guess I'll just need to acquire some more. Watch this space, if Eldar are the kind of Xenos that tickle your fancy. Again, if you like what I do, please consider having a look at my Instagram. And with that, I better go paint some more minis. Take care, and thanks for watching. Well, if you're still with me at this stage, you're doubtless here for a song. 2, 3, 4. Fuegan, sexy Fuegan, you'll melt in his mouth and by his hand. Fuegan, sexy Fuegan, prepare to be branded by his red-hot brand. Fuegan, Fuegan, the burning lance, a red-hot body and skin-tight pants, dragon scales and a fire pike. You better beware of his mighty strike. Fuegan, sexy Fuegan, you melt in his mouth and by his hand. Fuegan, sexy Fuegan, prepare to be branded by his red-hot brand. He wields a fearsome fire axe, as attractive as his clingy slacks. Armour melts at his molten shot, burning red, smoking harder than hot. Fuegan, sexy Fuegan, you melt in his mouth and by his hand. Fuegan, sexy Fuegan, prepare to be branded by his red-hot brand. I say prepare to be branded by his red-hot brand.